Welcome to Slash Forward. We're going to return to our important work investigating hyperregeneration in humans, in this case with the 1981 film Absurd. If you'd like to complete your certification in this important and expanding scientific field, subscribe to the channel. Let's get to it. We open on a large man running, being chased by a smaller man in a trench coat, who also appears to be suffering from occasional heart palpitations. As they both lumber and run through the darkness, the scenes are intercut with some expert-level spirography being executed by the young injured Katya, although her obsession disturbs her mother, who would prefer she take on a wider variety of hobbies to keep her mind sharp, and she's come to this conclusion on mostly ethical grounds.
You just keep doing the same design over and over again. It's not right.
Outside, the man nearly scales their security fence, but gets his ankles tugged by his pursuer, dragging him down the spike. This gets the dogs barking, which prompts young Willie to go check on them, and he opens the door to discover they now have some fresh sausage to go with their morning breakfast. The man is rushed to the hospital, where the doctors carefully attempt to reconfigure his intestines by constantly swapping out the forceps. This drags on a bit too long, resulting in him waking up on the table and requiring them to top off his anesthetics. Meanwhile, out in town, we see a hardcore gang of cycle boys harassing an old drunkard. They're run off by Sergeant Engelman, who comes with a warning for old Shaughnessy.
If I catch you drunk just once more, I'm gonna have to lock you up.
Well, what about now? But we're forced to put off our resolution to this conflict as he gets a call to head into the hospital to question the victim of the morning's violence. Even though we circle back to find that he's still deep in his surgery, they continue to pick away at his insides as things become touch and go for a while, but he makes it through, a fact the doctor finds disappointing, as he notes the patient's incredible recuperative abilities. It's like he doesn't even need the poor doctor at all. We find Engelman at the Bennett household, questioning Mrs. Bennett about how shocked and grossed out she was when the man appeared at her door. She agrees that she was, both shocked and grossed out to a significant degree, but can't add much more. On their way back to the hospital, they conveniently roll up on the trenchcoat man taking a night walk. They pull off to harass him a bit and ask him for ID. Luckily, he happens to be taking a walk with his passport. Now that he's been identified, Engelman acts like he knows him, inviting him into the cruiser to help get him to his destination. The sergeant then appears at the hospital, where he searches the man's clothes for any clues, but comes up empty. And Emily bids them a good evening as she heads off to the Bennett residence. Engelman then scores a break. There are Greek coins in the pocket, which matches the nation of origin of the man he picked up earlier but dropped off elsewhere. Now he really wants to question the guy, but the doctor's orders are no questions until the morning. So instead, he asks the nurse for some info, starting with what the dude even looks like.
He's huge. Not my type at all.
Very good. I'll just make note of that in my official investigative notebook so I don't forget later. After he leaves, they check in on the patient, making note of how incredibly good he is at recovering from physical trauma. Why, he even opens up his eyes at just the time the Greek fellow arrives at the window. This enrages him, and he struggles to get up to avenge himself. But luckily, his core is still shredded from the surgery, so they're able to hold him down. And after the man is escorted away at gunpoint, he begins to calm down a bit. This is a turn of good luck, as when we check back in with Engelman, he's in the process of looking for the man he dropped off earlier, only to get a report that they have him in custody at the hospital. So he heads right back there and immediately begins his interrogation. He goes in hard with an aggressive approach, hoping to squeeze info from the suspect through sheer force of will. While back in the recovery room, the nurse finds the patient awake again, causing her to freeze up in sheer terror, unable to react as he slowly ties her up, carefully selects a nearby Dremel, figures out how to get it going, and then bores it slowly into her temple. The noise from the struggle alerts them in the interrogation room, but they arrive only to find the bloody aftermath. Their new suspect is now lurking around town, keeping to the shadows to evade police, since they now have a more pressing suspect to investigate, and the original suspect's only crime was injuring this other guy who committed an even worse crime. They realign their focus. Cooperative, now that the heat's off him, Trenchcoat shares that the man they're pursuing is named Mikos, and that there's an unseen layer of reality at play here, but only Dr. Kramer can truly convince them. They all take a field trip to check in with the doctor, who's reviewing the tests he ran on the patient earlier. He reveals to them fantastic evidence that is scientifically inexplicable. Mikos is immortal, capable of regenerating dead cells, which makes him immune to physical injury. Engelman gets a call that provides more key information that we never hear, and it's then revealed that the man is actually the father. Shocking and important information, somehow. Now fully apprised of the what, Engelman insists on finding out the why, so they can try to get ahead of the situation. And that's simple. Mikos is a master of regeneration, but still imperfect in that he is insane, and he kills to fulfill the lust of his insanity. The father then reveals that the one type of cell Mikos can't regenerate is cerebral tissue, so if they take out his brain, he gon' die. Good info, but it does seem a bit untoward for a man of the law to be leading a murder party through town. But perhaps not, as we catch up with Mikos still lurking in the shadows, always looking for another victim. He checks a seemingly abandoned industrial building that luckily still contains the night janitor cleaning up for the evening. He makes a go of it, but this old salt is both wily and agile, and even goes to work strapped up. Unfortunately, while his shots do find purchase, they are ineffectual, as his attacker shrugs him off and slams him onto the meat table, where he very slowly and carefully bifurcates his head until rendering the man dead. But no further. I mean, he's not a sicko. Back at the station, Engelman's running out of options. He can't get more men because the chief is busy watching the big game, Rams versus Steelers, and interrupting him even for an emergency would be a career-limiting move. So the trio is left to bring Mikos in on their own. They deputize the priest and even give him a car so they can spread out in multiple directions. Then we catch back up with Mikos, who's wandering the dark streets of the small town. He pulls back for cover when the Cycle Boys come ripping through looking for trouble, and again after they pull a Yui nearby and head the other way. But the last one has some trouble and is left behind to tinker with his motor. He's nearly killed by a passing motorist who tears through and buzzes them both, and then is killed to completion by Mikos, who takes out his anger over the hit-and-run driver on the young scumbag. The reckless motorist arrives home and tries to walk in like nothing happened, and we learn this is Ian Bennett, young Willie's father. He's disturbed to hear the news of the day, added on top of what just happened on the road, but he's really mostly concerned about ensuring they maintain their social schedule. So he goes to the study to calm himself and engage in a little pre-gaming before they head to the Fosters to check out their football game. Carol, unsettled about how the day is unfolded, tries to convince him they could just watch at home. However, Ian points out the Fosters just got a 19-inch rotodial Mitsubishi, and there's no way he's gonna watch his Rams on their crappy old Zenith. Meanwhile, we see the men are out, searching the area, listening to some slow jazz. Then the Bennetts say goodbye, heading to their game date and leaving irresponsible Peggy in charge until Emily gets there. We check in on Emily, who's taking the scenic route, which can be treacherous, not only for lack of sure footing, but also for a strong presence of startling old drunkards. Shaughnessy, you dumb bitch. At the forests, we see that everyone has arrived and immediately splits off to fulfill their respective roles. The men watching the kickoff in their traditional game day suits, optimized for observing American football. While everyone is going about their business, Mikos happens to lurk upon the culprit from his earlier scare, providing him a target for the evening's activities. Inside the house, Peggy drags Willie off to bed and tries to convince him to stay down with stories of the boogeyman. She then goes to check on the dog and steps outside. She cries desperately as Blitz just slowly veers away from her. Only afterwards does she choose to do a slow scan of her surroundings and ends up taking a pickaxe through the face. The police are just barely keeping up with the murders about town at the moment that Emily makes it to the Bennett residence. She gets pranked by Willie, who we come to realize likely suffers from an undiagnosed personality disorder, but finds the home otherwise quiet. Just to keep up with all the threads of the story, the adults are enjoying their traditional game day spaghetti, an easy and tasty treat for any football fan. Emily then tends to Katya and sends Willie off to watch the game. Then she gets a call at the house from Dr. Kramer, who informs her of the murder at the hospital. He lets her know about the spree killings and the special powers of the culprit, along with his one weakness. Just in case, he recommends she bed down at the Bennetts for the evening. Meanwhile, Willie is drawn away from the TV by a banging noise. He assumes it to be the dog and calls out before, much like his sister Peggy, he also decides to do a quick check of his surroundings. He manages to get away somehow, but thanks to Peggy's immature prior attempts to control his body via fairy tale, he bursts in shouting about the boogeyman, preventing anyone from taking him seriously. Despite the fact that he should clearly recognize this as the man from this morning, he allows Emily to go out and check on her own. She doesn't find anything, but as she reports this back to Willie, the lights go out. Seeing that the kids are likely going to bed now, Mrs. Bennett can finally relax, giving her the wherewithal to check in with Mr. Bennett on what's been eating at him all evening.
Nothing, other than running over a man today and not stopping to help him.
Good lord. Back at the house, Emily goes to check on the breakers and finds Peggy was already taking care of it. She immediately attempts to call the police, but the phone's broken. Failing that, she instructs Willie to go outside and run, but he doesn't want to go, it's spooky. So he meets her halfway by going outside and then walking off slowly when he's ready, not because she told him. Emily makes her way back to Katya's room and does her best to convince her to sit tight and not be frightened. But soon, there's a large man at the door who wants to murder them both. As they work to hold him off, Willie makes his way around the house and comes in through the back window. When he starts calling out for them, it draws Mikos away from the door. Quickly converting from turtle to panther, Emily grabs some scissors and ventures out to save him. But Willie basically uses her as bait, so he can circle back to Katya, who he asks to let him in the room, despite knowing that she's strapped down to a traction machine. Mikos spends some time trying to get Emily into the oven as Katya works to disconnect herself from the machine. It takes a good amount of time as there are many leather straps, and Willie yells and pounds on the door all the while. Emily blisters and slowly succumbs to the roasting, which is exactly what I'd envisioned burning alive to be like. After banging her head around a few final times, it ends for her. Willie witnesses this and decides to dip out the same way he came in, and then he's saved when Emily gets her second wind. She misses the brain, however, and so her scissors are returned to her via the jugular. Meanwhile, the Bennetts are busy discussing Ian's hit and run when they see the lights are back on at the house, and they suspect that something is up. Katya finally frees herself from her bonds and is now able to go anywhere they have suspended rings for her to grab onto. Unfortunately, the noise from her contraption falling attracts the monster's attention, so when she goes to leave, he comes for her. Luckily, her spirography was handy in that she uses the compass to create some distance before giving him a Three Stooges special, which he fails to block. Since he now has to regenerate 2 entire eyeballs, he has no choice but to feel around in the dark for a while. So Katya cranks up the high fidelity and slips out under cover of noise. She stays just ahead of him, eventually trapping herself in a dead end, and it's only his tremendous height that saves her from being found. After he lumbers off, it is she who is chasing him. Elsewhere in town, the father comes upon young Willie in a car, and Willie leads him back to the house right as Mikos gets his hands on Katya, who for some reason attempted to escape by creeping as close to him as possible. He uses her as a weapon, and then the two men struggle to their knees, putting Mikos at a very convenient height. And with the decorative axe lying around, Katya's mission is clear, and she whacks away at the big man's neck repeatedly in an attempt to free it from his shoulders. Right then, everyone else also arrives at the house and wonders the best way to proceed safely. Luckily, the decision is made for them when Katya emerges, triumphantly covered in the blood of her enemies. See? I have a website set up where you can support the channel through donations or merch. I'd like to take a moment to give a huge thanks to my donors memorialized in the Hall of Headshots. Absurd is Joe D'Amato's follow-up to Anthropophagus, and while I feel like they ramped up certain aspects of the film, it didn't totally blow me away. When you have to skip around constantly to carry on all the various threads of a convoluted plot, as well as splicing in enough game footage to keep the footballers happy, it leaves less time for the stuff we all came to see. If you enjoyed the video, I'd love for you to become a part of the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching.